There are areas, there's a bunch of types of deep sea mining, but what we can do now, there's these little rocks called nodules across all the oceans, but particularly in the Pacific, that you can just go down there and they just precipitate out of the ocean, and you can go pick up a bunch of metals, nickel and cobalt and copper and manganese. And so that's extremely valuable now, and because we have these new technologies, we can access them. But the challenge across all of these, including potentially a bunch of similar military applications, is we don't have power down there. We either have to bring it with us in terms of like batteries, which they, again, as you said, you have to deal with these cold temperatures, so maybe that's not super great. But then even if you have a battery, you're down there for a day, maybe 2 days. Or you have to do a very long cable, 3 or 4 miles under sea to provide power. Those telecommunication cables, they actually are piping power from the landing stations across continents. They're a 10,000 mile power line to be able to provide power for those cables.
All right. Welcome to the podcast. So we have Alex Gilbert here today. And so Alex, for all these, I'll give you a little intro on for the audience, so they have a little bit of background on you. And so Alex Gilbert, he's a technology strategist and regulatory architect at Xeno Power, where they are working on developing radioisotope power systems to make nuclear batteries. He's a graduate from Colorado School of Mines, prestigious engineering and applied science university in Golden, Colorado. Alex is also an accomplished wreck diver with many dives off the coast of New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina, and the Bahamas. So, all right, well, welcome. And we'll dive in here. And I think to start off, one of the things I would say is let's learn a little bit about you. Where'd you come from, and how'd you get your journey where you ended up getting into nuclear research?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Andrew. This is fun. I ended up in a very specific role now, but it really started off just when I was back in really high school. I was starting to think about career stuff and always wanted to do something good for the world. And so I actually had an uncle that was working in international development and had done a ton of stuff with the UN, had been to all sorts of conflict zones. So I was really interested in development, and then I went to school. And it really quickly realized that if you care about international development, you care about environment, because environment is a huge factor for like people's well-being. But then if you care about environment, you care about energy, because energy has the biggest impacts on our environment. And also environment is the biggest constraint on energy production. So that kind of led to a very meandering path in the first the energy sector, then energy markets, and then really technology policy. And I never intended to be in nuclear. In fact, my first grad degree, my mentor is one of the most well-known anti-nuclear academics in the world. And so he taught me a ton of this stuff. And actually, it's really funny. I've got a book downstairs that he wrote. That was his anti-nuclear book, and I asked him to sign it. I love having people sign books for me. And literally, and he wrote, "Hey, Alex, I hope that your dreams come true. ... unless they involve nuclear." And so I sent him a message when I formally joined the nuclear industry. I'm like, "Hey, guess how this turned out."
Wow, yeah, and it's funny because you'll end up getting a bit of a different laugh, because everybody thought nuclear was kind of dead, and it's making a huge comeback these days. So you may actually get the laugh on that one.
I mean, so what really happened is I went into the industry, actually kind of a little bit of what you do in terms of looking at like investment markets and energy markets. My first job, I had my own Bloomberg terminal and Thomson Reuters icon, and I just played with that all day, looking at all sorts of gas and power futures markets and doing price projections. But I kind of just got sucked into nuclear because nuclear is the largest carbon-free source of energy in the United States. It's a huge part of our electric grid. It's like the backbone from a reliability perspective, but we haven't built new plants in like 35, 40 years now. And we had like this really intense time where we built a bunch of plants and then we just kind of maintained them and we didn't build anymore. And we're getting to this point like 10 years ago, Fukushima just happened. There was this like hope for renaissance in nuclear technology that failed. And we're starting to look for like, hey, what's the next solutions? And so there started becoming some demand in BC for people that could focus on nuclear policy. How do you actually create the conditions for regulatory reform for companies to commercialize this, to invest in it? And so, again, never intended to go into nuclear, but we started seeing this very early set of companies that were looking at building these technologies. And these aren't now like the companies that are, in many cases, the most well known in the sector, like NuScale or Oklo. They were just starting out and really trying to figure out new ways to do atomic energy. But there's almost no one doing policy or regulatory reform. So I kind of got sucked into that. And then I actually ended up joining a think tank that I joined. And about 4 months after I joined, the executive director quit, leaving me with as the only employee. And so basically, like there were so few of us, like 8 or 9 years ago. So we were really trying to do a lot of pioneering stuff. And then, especially now, since I've been working on the nuclear batteries, it's kind of crazy to look at the fission sector, and it's exploded. Like all these companies that, like, hey, I was like, I'm not sure if they can make the market work. I'm not sure about their technology. They're now doing really well, and they have a lot of good opportunities, especially because of like AI. So yeah, it's been a very exciting time for the sector.
Yeah, I mean that's it's definitely. I mean, you go from what do you have? Yeah, back in the day, you had with 3 Mile Island, and you had all those disasters, and that kind of really put it into a cold period for nuclear. And but yeah, it's really kind of cool seeing, especially with new policy and stuff like that coming to the fore. Where, and I wanted to actually get to it. I mean, we can maybe do it now, but like with regards to like when they talk about carbon now, like in that sense with the carbon, everything's always like no carbon, no carbon, no carbon. But isn't carbon actually good to some degree? Like, for instance, like when trees, and stuff like that, like, isn't that's why a lot of people say a way to fix a lot of stuff would just be to add more trees and whatnot. So where's the dynamic come in with the carbon? But from uh, the nuclear standpoint, what was like also when they're bringing these things on now is the fact that like did we just put like was it like Oyster Creek and all these other ones were they just turned off and left just to sit there, or was it like is it part of the distribution, or is the cost the big thing with regards to having to um make like the infrastructure for it just so expensive?
Yeah, so I'll start with the carbon side. So we have a carbon cycle on the planet. We do know that there is a greenhouse effect, and as I'm sure we'll get to, I do a lot of stuff on the space side as well. And when we actually look within the solar system, we can tell that when you have certain gases that are greenhouse gases, it helps change the heating of that relevant planet. And so, straight up, if we did not have carbon on Earth right now in our atmosphere, we would be in a deep ice age. We'd be a lot colder. It is a huge part of how we've had our cycles. And what's happened is because we've been going to so much old fossil carbon, stuff that was buried by life hundreds of millions of years ago, we've essentially changed the carbon balance, or it was kind of balanced in the atmosphere. Now it's increasing. And so we're seeing an increase on average in the overall temperatures. And so when we're looking at really decade or century level kind of timescales, we do need to get that back into control. We need to kind of bring it back into balance. And there's a bunch of different ways that can do that. And one of the things that I know you and I have talked about is in the US, one of the big drivers that we've had there is natural gas. So especially renewables, when we're looking 15 years ago, we're still pretty young. They have a very important role in the grid, but they were not going to be able to displace coal as fast as we needed to. And so because of hydraulic fracturing and shale, we had a massive growth of natural gas power production in the country. But that's where there start becoming problems for nuclear, because we do pretty effective energy markets in the United States. We don't have like nationalized energy companies. We have competition. And so when we had many decades where we didn't have load growth and we weren't really building a lot of new power plants, we had markets that once lower priced natural gas came in, it went to all the power generators starting lower revenue. And so for nuclear plants, that's what happened is, especially the smaller units, especially if you had like a smaller reactor or only one reactor to site, economics just, you couldn't compete with gas. So we started seeing a number of closures. Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, so no, sorry. Yeah, nat gas is just like once the fracking revolution kicked off, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, if anybody even goes and looks at their bill, it's kind of wild, which I've done before. Like I think my bill is I don't know, $18 for the month. And then when you actually look at what, like, it's like 82 cents for the gas, and the rest is all like fees. So gas is incredible. I mean, it's pretty hard to compete with that, but from, that can't be the only thing. There's got to be multiple sources in the energy pie, right?
Yeah, and look, the nice thing about gas from like an environmental perspective is it killed all the bad coal plants. There are a lot of coal plants that had like no pollution controls. They're built in like the 50s and the 60s. Most all of those have closed now. And so, kind of what we need to look at moving forward, and the big thing that's happened is last 2 or 3 years we've had flat load growth since the 70s, since the energy crisis. That's flipped. That's flipped because of electric vehicles, because of AI demand, because we're bringing manufacturing back to the country. And so all of a sudden, all these grids that have been like fighting over the last scrap for years, now we have to figure out how to build more energy and how to produce more energy and do it in a way that balances all these different resources and their pros and cons. And so that's where we're seeing a big role now for nuclear to have this resurgence.
Yeah, no, that's definitely it's definitely nice, and it's definitely nice to see, like you said, whether it's, whether you have electric, whether you have natural gas. Now you're starting to have clean coal, which, like you said, it used to be quite dirty, and now they're figuring out ways to really filter it and really make it a lot cleaner. And with all of this stuff coming on, it's kind of really exciting actually to see it all coming on around a similar time frame. And that whole pie is going to, I mean, that's why I think, one, we're actually consuming way more energy than we ever did, but yet prices are actually coming down a bit and stuff. And as we'll get into, like, nuclear, I mean, I'm pretty excited because, well, one, I mean, I think we'll have to talk a bit about, because France has been mostly run off nuclear for quite a long time, right?
Yeah. They've been 60 to 80% nuclear for like 4 decades at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty incredible. And so what, I guess, to go with it, what was the big, was it really 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and all them? Was that really, was it in like that just scared the hell out of everybody? And then everybody was just like, oh, um, but then it always makes me wonder, because you also had stuff like the Exxon Valdez and stuff like that off of the west coast of, the US. And I mean, it was awful. And you obviously had the BP horizon down in the Gulf and stuff, but yet it didn't necessarily make us say, oh my God, we have to just shut all these off, or, whatnot. So what do you think is your thoughts behind, like, why it didn't happen for that, but yet they went just super crazy and really against nuclear for those other few incidences? Um, and then how is it that France was able to keep using it, yet the whole rest of, why did we go away from it?
Yeah. There's a lot of complex answers there. I think one, just kind of, there's a fear factor to radiation that's different. So when you think about a fire or an oil spill, it's super visual. You can see the dirty birds, you can see the smoke, you can inhale the smoke. With radiation, when we're looking at radioactive materials, you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it. So it has this like very unique kind of fear property, like, oh, there was this big explosion at a nuclear plant. I don't know if like I'm being impacted right now. So that is, I think, kind of underlying it. And also historically, especially during the Cold War, there was a lot of conflation between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And that's because even like institutionally, the same government agency that developed our initial commercial nuclear power fleet and regulated it was the same one that was detonating bombs in the Pacific. So there was
Yeah.
this kind of like, oh yeah, nuclear bombs and nuclear holocaust of the entire world. Oh, now you want to use nuclear energy, even though the technologies are very different. And so 3 Mile Island came around, and a lot of people kind of blame 3 Mile Island for nuclear stopping in the US. But the reality is that most analysis would show it was the energy crisis. When we had the energy crisis in the 70s, the oil embargo, we didn't use oil for a ton of electricity, though we did actually use oil for some electricity back then. But everyone started paying attention to energy, implementing energy efficiency. So we went from like 7 to 10% load growth per year across the country to like zero. And so if you're building and building and building with that type of load growth, you have to double your grid every 10 years or so. You need a ton of new power plants. But once that changed, you don't need any more power plants. And so we had essentially like 100 gigawatts or so of plants that got built in about 25 years. We had like, depending on how you count, 80 to 100 gigawatts that got canceled. A ton of them went bankrupt. There was a ton of cost overruns issues. These are really big projects, so it was really hard to finance them. There's actually a lot of lessons now if we want to grow nuclear energy again. There's a lot of growth issues. Like you just couldn't hire engineers because everyone else was hiring the engineers. And then 3 Mile Island kind of hit at the end of that, and now there was a big pullback. Chernobyl was very bad, but that's also because the Soviets were crazy and had extremely bad nuclear safety practices. And that reactor was not a safe reactor, period. And when we really look at the sector now, we have an insane level of safety. So, like, I'm the safety officer at our company. I'm in charge of it. We literally, since we've been a small startup, we've drilled on nuclear safety culture values. We inherit that from the nuclear Navy. The industry itself, like, everyone talks about how the regulation is so intense or tough or anything. At our company, the most intense safety person that we have to convince it's safe to do something is me. And that's something that, like, I honestly think that if you talk to most of our leadership team, they would fight me because they would say that they're in the same position, because we want to use these technologies responsibly, because there's this extra stigma associated with them. We know if there's one accident, it will impact the entire industry. But also just like we can be safe and be economic and be better than the other industries. Like that's something that our industry can do.
Yeah, it's kind of quite interesting too. Like you also could compare it also with like, well, not until recently, right? But the aviation industry and stuff like that, where if you have like actually disciplined, rigorous controls and whatnot, um, you can actually make a lot of these things like quite safe, and especially when you build in redundancies and stuff like that, and whatnot. And so, yeah, it's. I mean, I guess so. It's getting its second, well, it's getting another go. People are really warming up to it, and it sounds like you guys, it's pretty awesome, are really looking at it, and the industry in general are just looking at it like, hey, we really want to be responsible about it this go around, just so we don't have another issue where it then gets put back in a cold period, and people don't want it. So no, that's definitely really exciting. So do you want to go into, and kind of, I guess, I don't think for the average person, we obviously, we think of a battery, we think of, I don't know, lithium ion, or, in just your normal battery pack. Maybe it's in your Tesla, maybe it's in your cell phone, whatever it is. So what's like a normal battery? And then how does, and how do you go about kind of creating these nuclear isotope batteries that you guys are really pioneering?
Sure. So most type of batteries, electrical batteries, they're really just chemical batteries in most cases. What you do is you have some sort of configuration of different materials that allows you to have a charge, put that charge into some sort of form, and then discharge that. And right now, there's actually like a whole battery revolution happening right now about how to make a more efficient battery for an electric vehicle. Improved batteries is actually a huge reason why electric vehicles are coming up, is because like they're now cost effective, and they also have some advantages over internal combustion engines. When we're looking at nuclear batteries, it's not really the same concept, because we're not really providing electricity in and doing some sort of transformation to then discharge it. What we're doing is we're essentially using the atom as a way to store energy. And when you look at nuclear materials, you have essentially all of the elements that you can think of. So hydrogen, oxygen, uranium, all of those have a certain number of protons associated with them. The number of protons determine how many, what the element is. But there's also a varying level of neutrons. Sometimes you have more, sometimes you have less. And the configurations that you have, sometimes just because of the relationships between the protons and the neutrons and kind of how they help bind themselves together and then interact with external matter, sometimes they're unstable. You essentially don't, the protons want to pull apart. They want to push each other away because they're positively charged. The neutrons help hold them together. And so when you have this instability, those atoms decay. They want to release that energy because they're like unstable. And so when you look in nuclear scientists have tons of charts for this. There's actually thousands of types of what we call isotopes, which are elements with varying numbers of neutrons. Many of them are stable, many of them are unstable. And when we look at a nuclear reactor, what a nuclear reactor is really doing is it's fissioning primarily uranium 235, which is an isotope of uranium. Most of what it has is actually 238 and doesn't fission. but it's fissioning that and it's essentially splitting that. And the best way I can describe what that looks like is it's almost like alchemy. You start with this really big atom and you split it. And by splitting a ton of them, you end up with a whole spectrum of elements and isotopes, many of which are also unstable. And by the time you look at spent nuclear fuel, it's like every single element that you have in the periodic table, and then varying levels of instability. So radioisotope power, nuclear batteries, is we pick one of those isotopes, one of those that has a favorable decay profile, and then we can use that to create energy because it's radioactive decay. So you've got this unstable atom, but when you have a bunch of them, it decays in a predictable manner that we call the half-life. And over a certain number of years, half of it will decay. So if you're trying to do different things, there's a ton of nuclear science that we do, medical applications, cancer treatments. Those are all things that we use different types of isotopes for. What we do is we pick the isotopes that essentially are able to produce heat because of how their decay works for a long period of time. And that allows us to package it together into something that is basically a battery. It's charged by nuclear reactions, but now you've got this energy source that is crazy dense compared to any other sort of chemical battery.
Gotcha. Okay. And that density is what's allowing it to have that such a long, which is approximately what, 30 to 40 year half-life or something?
Yeah, so depending on what isotope you're looking at, what we're looking at for our initial systems is called strontium-90. It's actually a pretty big part of what you produce when you have a fissioning atom, and that's about a 30-year half-life. So if you get that material, it means that in 30 years it'll be half, and then another 30 years will be a quarter of the original amount. And so it's super predictable, and also it's a physical process. Like you can't turn it off. So that's something that like you've now got essentially physics-based reliability.
Yeah, and unlimited. Well, pretty much for quite a long time. It's just going to keep producing that. Now, one of the other things. So you were describing the atom. Now, obviously, when they smash them together, that's how they end up getting these, hadron collider black holes. But for a regular atom, would it basically is that kind of like when they have like what we just kind of dealt with in Iran, which I thought maybe this would be an interesting one to kind of bring in is in order to create it. They put them in centrifuges, right? And is it basically the spinning of the atom? Where is that kind of how they split it, or if they get it to just spin faster and then it separates? Is that kind of how that works? Because I don't think they're not smashing them into each other, right?
Yeah, so that kind of smashing stuff, a lot of that is for science. Now, if you look at fusion, fusion works by fusing very light elements. Fission is splitting very heavy elements. There's actually a really interesting, you get more energy fusing lighter elements, you get more energy fissioning heavier elements. But yeah, that's exactly it, is when you're looking at natural uranium is about 99.3% 238. It's the isotope uranium-238. And so that means that the total number of neutrons and protons is 238. But that isotope is not fissile, meaning that if you put a bunch of it together, it's not going to have a chain reaction. It's essentially if it gets hit by a neutron, there's a chance it could fission, but it's not going to create more neutrons. And so when we're looking at a nuclear reaction, what we want to try and do is pick something that you hit it with a neutron, it generates at least one, but preferentially 2 or 3 neutrons that can go hit other atoms, and then you get that chain reaction, and that's how you either do a weapon or you do energy. 235 is the best isotope in nature for being fissile. And so it's 235 neutrons and protons with this uranium atom. And so that difference in mass of 3, we call them baryons, it's either a neutron or a proton, that's enough of a difference that you can separate it. But remember, these are isotopes. They're the same element, so you can't chemically separate it. If you've got the chemical right there, there's no way for you to add in a solvent or do some sort of reaction or heat it up to try and separate it out. What you have to do is you have to figure out a strategy that takes advantage of this little mass difference, this 1% difference in mass. And so for uranium, what we originally did with the Manhattan program, what we do when we're looking around the world to enrich things, you put them in centrifuges, you gasify it, and you basically spin it. And you spin it enough over time so that slowly that 235 and that 238 separate out, but it takes a lot of work. So in the civil sector, we usually go up to about 5%. 5% uranium-235 is what we can run in most of our reactors. The advanced reactors, the next generation reactors, we're often going to a lot higher because there's a lot better efficiencies. We're trying to get to 15 to 20% 235. Weapons grade is you can make one that like say above 20%, but most of the time when you're talking about weapons, especially for a new nuclear weapons program, it's 90% enrichment. It has to be 90% 235. That's a lot of work to do. And so what was really in the news looking at Iran, you need thousands of these centrifuges, and they need to be in chains to be able to start from this natural uranium to get it progressively enriched to the point where it's actually a level where you can have a sustained chain reaction. Because if there's too much 238, that will actually stop the reaction. That will actually prevent you from having the completion of the chain reaction. And so when you're looking at what the US did, what Israel did, it's actually not hard. This is going to sound maybe crazy. It's pretty straightforward to build a nuclear weapon. You can find most of the designs on Wikipedia. The basic principles a physics student at this point can figure out. It's control of enrichment technology and the infrastructure around it that allows us to prevent other countries from developing nuclear weapons programs.
Well, and what do you mean, like, in the sense? So this is one thing that I think it's actually probably good to bring up, because so many people are kind of going back and forth about this. Is it's so confusing because it's, you know, how long does it take to get it? Well, for one, how about this? If Iran claims that they are only using it for non weapons grade reasons, so let's just say that that's their argument, then it seems like they really wouldn't want to enrich it past maximum 20%, really. So the fact that I believe it's known that they might not be at 90%, but that they're well over the 20% mark. So then would that leave us to have pretty big confidence to say, hey, dude, like, why? I mean, you should have stopped at 20%. Why are you up at 60 or 70? Or I'm not exactly sure the exact numbers that they're at, but it sounded, I don't know, every other day they seem to come out and, oh, well, they're 3 weeks away or this. Like, what is the reality on where they're at from a percentage standpoint, where that 90% of like, hey, this is actually, can be used for a weapon?
Yeah, so when you're looking at a reactor design, there's actually it's much more straightforward to design a reactor that is at very high enrichments. So 90% uranium 235 you can use, and we do use in reactors. It makes sense for things like research reactors. It makes sense for space reactors because it's much more mass efficient if you're launching into space. It's what we use for our nuclear navy because it has a lot of performance benefits, especially in a military context. So there are potential reasons that you want that. That said, civil nuclear technologies around the world, it's low enriched uranium. That's what we use because we want to avoid this weapons issue specifically. And so that's where there's no design that someone's trying to sell to Iran that needs this level of enrichment. Right now, they have a whole bunch of different stocks, but the most concerning is they have a significant quantity up to about 60% enrichment. And one of the big issues moving forward is it's very clear that we did a fair amount of damage to their nuclear program, both on the like people side and on the centrifuge and infrastructure side. But at 60%, they don't need as much infrastructure anymore to get to 90%. And we don't know where that 60% stockpile is. So that specific quantity is very concerning. But this is why we knew this was not a civil program. You don't enrich to these levels in the way that we're doing it unless it's a covert weapons program. And that's why you're able to get the US, EU, Russia, and China to say, like, hey, let's not let them do this because this is pretty dangerous.
Yeah, and that was something I was trying to go back and forth with one of my friends about this once. It was, and this is where I feel like there was so much BS information, and yet the truth was always somewhere a little off of everything. Is that one? I think one, they had been they were lying in the sense that they were just using it for peaceful purposes. They were clearly trying to get to a weapons grade level. Okay, so they're trying to get there. It seems pretty clear that they were fairly. To me, it seems they're pretty clear they were fairly far off. I think that's where maybe Israel got a bit sensationalist. Is that, I mean, I'm pretty sure that Bibi's been claiming they were 3 weeks away for 15 years. So I think from an honest perspective, stepping back, we could say they were trying to go with it weapons grade, but maybe they weren't as close as people who really knows how close they really were? Okay, so to get to the actual, because there was a lot of stuff in the media with regards to the damage. So if you actually, I don't know that I don't even think that many of the shows even actually on TV showed what it actually looks like to have all these centrifuges and stuff like that. And so, um, they're basically almost like what these metal or glass cylinders, and they don't look very like you could go in there with a baseball bat and just start destroying them all. Like it's not this is not something that is, super heavy duty. Now I'm sure they're obviously encased in a mountain and whatnot, but it seems that dropping those bombs on that did substantial damage, and I don't think anybody's even getting down there for any time soon. So whether or not everything was destroyed in there or some, but back to your point, it's not a fast process to get all those centrifuges rebuilt, people back down there, and to get them up and operating, and then the amount of time that they have to spend to get this highly enriched. So I think just for people to understand is that um they're they're probably a long ways off from rebuilding Fedor and um Natanz and some of them. Like, I mean, if they want to do it again, sure, but it's going to take them a while.
Yeah, I think that the damage reports are still coming in. One of the things that's actually really different nowadays, or open source intelligence changes what the public can know about this. Commercial satellites, in particular, but also social media, it allows a lot of people in the civil non-proliferation community to actually evaluate what the government is saying. And it's very clear there was significant damage done to their infrastructure. They would have to do a lot more to be able to rebuild that. The human capital element too really shouldn't be understated. The beginning of the Israeli campaign was actually focused on taking out the top nuclear scientists. That is probably going to have as much damage as the actual physical infrastructure as well for them to rebuild. So yeah, we're in a different world now, and I know there's a lot of debates about like using the military force and everything, but this is like kind of why nuclear weapons are such a thorny problem. Is that once a country has a weapon, there's no way to stop it. They will hide them. You will never be able to interfere with them again. And if you're dealing with a country like Iran, they might well try and use one because they're crazy. It is not it's not a traditional kind of mad situation like we had during the Cold War. And so that's one of the problems from a public policy perspective is like there's a bunch of different ways we can try and solve it. But at the end of the day, if they cross the threshold and they get a weapon, then we're in a different world and there's no ability to influence that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and that was again, I think the tough one was, I tend to have a belief that I know a lot of, there's a lot of stuff where people seem crazy. I do think that largely speaking, even Kim Jong Un or, I think the reality is behind closed doors. Because you see this with the back channel communications and whatnot. I don't think people are as crazy as the media makes them out to be. To me, just my take was that I thought that the reason Iran wanted it so badly, I don't even know that maybe they would have used it, but I mean, I think the big thing was is they wanted it from a negotiating standpoint. Like, and I think you can look at it, for instance, like take India and Pakistan recently, right? India is demonstrably bigger than Pakistan. They could walk through them in 2 seconds. Um, and even Pakistan, I mean, you could drop a nuke, and I mean, yeah, you might take out Delhi. That's 30 million, but I don't know. They have what 1.6 billion. So, but the thing is, here's this tiny country that really Pakistan would be not considered that relevant, to be honest, on a world stage. And here, because they have nukes, it makes them have a lot more leverage. And I really truly think that that was why Iran wanted it and was willing to go to these crazy lengths. Is I think it would have given them massive leverage at the negotiating table, and it would not be able to get pushed around or bullied around, or not that they're getting pushed around, but I mean, they've clearly done their share of issues, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, and stuff like that. But um, that was kind of at least how I viewed it. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I definitely there's a level of rationality and I think irrationality with a lot of these states. So I think that on the one hand, yes, it's very clear that becoming a regional power was in their calculus, and if they got a weapon, then they could potentially be a regional power for a long time. But the other part that makes me somewhat concerned, which I think is maybe a bit different than some other states, is a lot of the states in the Middle East are multi-ethnic states, and so there's a level of internal stability that goes into all these calculus. And so there's like definitely national prestige associated with having potentially a weapons program. Regime survival is definitely a huge question. But at the end of the day, if they're actually worried about regime stability, Iran's not going to fall because of an external invader. It's a 90 million person country. It's going to be very unlikely to have kind of an Iraq style invasion, but they could fall if there is riots, if there are people clamoring for reform internally. And so weapons don't actually help them with that. If anything, I think there's a lot of fallout now in the country because all of the other parts of Iran's external power have now been pushed back pretty considerably, and so they're in a much weaker position than even 3 or 4 years ago. And that's even before like the last like 3 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point because actually, it's kind of if for anybody who reads up on the Iran-Iraq war back in the 1980s, this is what 1980, 1988. Saddam had way bigger technical military at the time than Iran did, but um, they were completely unsuccessful. And it's quite ironic, actually, that I don't know that many maybe people know this, but Israel was actually supplying Iran with weapons at the time. So that was just to give a little bit of irony in there for people who are listening that Israel was assisting Iran at the time. Um,
Well,
but
I think that's
and that was actually when and that was post 1979. So that's actually quite interesting too. Is you can't even just say that it was under the Shah. That was actually even under uh, the the mullahs, and so you know what's the I guess the old saying my enemy's enemy's my friend or whatever. At the time, Saddam was the boogeyman. But I do agree with you, like in general, and I do think to Israel's credit that the beeper operation, because obviously, so for Iran, also for people, I just to give a little bit of context, when the U.S. did in 2003 went into Iraq and removed Saddam, one of the huge vacuums that we created was that Iran stepped in and actually has had a large control over the Iraqi government for quite a while. And I think we kind of, as you pointed to the ethnicity thing, we seem to really fail to miss the whole Sunni Shia thing. And so Iran really capitalized on so much of the Shia there, and they really kind of stepped in. And this was actually how I don't know if people realize how Soleimani was able to move around so easily throughout Iraq, and that's where we droned him. But it was because of their alliance and the amount of with the Shia there. So it's definitely. I mean, I agree. Like when you look at Hamas and Hezbollah and all that stuff, and then the beeper operation, and then like you said, with them going in and kind of killing so many of their higher ups in the Quds Force and IRGC and everything. Israel's like, I mean, I think Israel's probably done the biggest smash to really kind of bring them to the table, and then this was kind of the nail in the coffin, and so it's kind of ironic. I think today Tucker was having a. Did you see that? I don't know if you saw. He was having a an interview with the head of not the Ayatollah, but one under him in Iran. It was quite interesting. But yeah. So it's I guess to get back to the thing that's really that yeah. I mean and the amount of rhetoric and all that stuff coming out of it, and had they had it, it could be possible that they would have used it in an aggressive fashion towards Israel.
yeah. I mean, it's in general. I think one of the things that, especially maybe not you and I, but I think a lot of people in the public just don't appreciate that we're heading into a chaotic era in geopolitics. And I think that especially when we were growing up, we were in an abnormally stable time. But kind of the mix of economics, geopolitics, changing populations, just across the board, I think we're seeing a whole bunch more instabilities and changes. And I think that that's going to become kind of the new normal for a while.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. It seems like every time he tries to do one piece thing, another one pops up. So and it's kind of interesting because even old stuff is kind of resurfacing from I think there was mentions of stuff regarding Serbia, where I think most of us, or at least I had the impression that the former Yugoslavia and all that was not something that was going to spark up. But apparently, I guess there was potential for stuff like that and whatnot. So, but hopefully, who knows? Hopefully, cooler heads will prevail in some of these. But yeah, it's definitely been peaking up. But I wanted to so get back into a little bit more on what you guys are focused on. So one of the things, so you guys are really kind of covering. So for people, so when you have like a regular a battery and whatnot, and most of those, one of the big things that you run into as an issue with a regular battery is the cold, right? And so you guys really seem to a lot of the stuff you guys are working on with nuclear really kind of specializes uh, in solving this issue, and a lot of it revolves around basically cold environments. So I don't know if maybe we want to start off with. Do you want to start off with deep sea? You want to start off with satellites? What do you want? I'll let you go with whatever one you want to go with first, and we'll kind of cover that from the deep sea, the space, and the Arctic.
Yeah, let's start on the bottom and go up. So basically, when we're looking at our technology, nuclear batteries is probably the easiest way to describe them. They're formerly known as radioisotope power systems. What you do is you take the nuclear material. There's a couple of different isotopes. Plutonium-238 is what NASA uses for deep space missions. Super high performance, long lasting. We're looking at Americium-241 as a more available alternative to 238, primarily again for space missions. Strontium-90 is by far the most used historically. The Soviet Union had about 1,000 of these systems during the Cold War. The United States had about 100. These were all for terrestrial applications in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, on the ocean, in the deep sea. And we're not talking about megawatts or super big power plants. We're talking about small scale battery systems. So what you do with one of these kind of strontium systems, you take the nuclear material, you basically package it in something like the size of a can, and that can contains the nuclear material. That's like your primary safety barrier. That's what lets you move it around outside facilities. And depending on the technology, you can put several of those together and you produce power. It's not a ton of power. It's 10 watts to maybe 100 watts, maybe a couple hundred watts. So think like the size of a light bulb or the size of a microwave in terms of power output. But the big difference is that microwave or that light bulb goes for 3 decades or 2 decades. It goes for a pretty long amount of time depending on the isotope that you're looking at. So when we're looking at this right now, there's never been a commercial attempt to do this technology. It's always been by governments and for governments. And in large part, that's because the governments have been the only ones going to the deep sea or in the Arctic or the Antarctic or going to outer space. And that's changing really across the board. We have a whole bunch of different technologies that are happening, just general advanced technologies, but also things like launch vehicles, remote operated vehicles in the deep ocean. So we're seeing this kind of demand now. And so to start, when we're looking at the bottom, on the ocean, we're seeing a huge change. So the deep seabed is probably one of the most unknown locations on Earth. We kind of have some basic like surface level sonar mapping, but we actually look at it. Very few parts of it have been surveyed properly or have been observed. And so there's a bunch of different applications though that we can now use. Probably the biggest one that like it's going to be most relevant for people is the internet. So the global internet is actually comprised of about 600 submarine telecommunication cables, very long cables that cross underneath the oceans and connect the continents. That is actually where most of the intercontinental internet traffic flows. And that's extremely valuable from an economic perspective. It's also a huge security risk because you can cut those cables pretty easily. And China and Russia and others are looking at how you do that right now. So those cables are kind of like the basic undersea infrastructure that we know is important. But there's other things too. There's offshore oil and gas production, which we're starting to do a lot of in the deep sea. There is oceanography to understand, like, first of all, what's down there, but also there's a new class of things, bioprospecting. We try and find new types of life, and then we can use that to create medicines. That's becoming increasingly important for a lot of different types of treatments. More recently, and I were talking about this, there's been a pretty big push for deep sea mining. There are areas, there's a bunch of types of deep sea mining, but what we can do now, there's these little rocks called nodules across all the oceans, but particularly in the Pacific, that you can just go down there and they just precipitate out of the ocean and you can go pick up a bunch of metals, nickel and cobalt and copper and manganese. And so that's extremely valuable now. And because we have these new technologies, we can access them. But the challenge across all of these, including potentially a bunch of similar military applications, is we don't have power down there. We either have to bring it with us in terms of like batteries, which they, again, as you said, you have to deal with these cold temperatures, so maybe that's not super great. But then even if you have a battery, you're down there for a day, maybe 2 days, or you have to do a very long cable, 3 or 4 miles under sea to provide power. Those telecommunication cables, they actually are piping power from the landing stations across continents. They're a 10,000 mile power line to be able to provide power for those cables. And there's so much efficiency lost there. There's all sorts of operational issues. So really where our kind of value proposition is, by bringing power to the seabed, we actually have a permanent presence down there. And that changes the economics of everything.
Now, also, is this something? Is Russia, is China, are they all kind of doing the similar kind of thing? And where do we fall within that? You know, is it, or are we pioneering this kind of now? And this would give us a huge advantage also on being able to, um, have control over, like you said, uh, those cables and stuff.
Yeah, so there's kind of like, I think maybe three types of ways to interact with the deep sea bed. One is a surface vessel essentially doing lines. And so that's how we used to lay the cables as an example. The early gray zone warfare attacks that we saw against submarine cables, particularly in Europe, were actually from ships that would just drag anchors across them. And you just drag an anchor and you can cut the cable. That's like the most low tech version of this. But then the second one is a remote operated vehicle. So these are not crewed submersibles, but they're essentially a robot that is connected to your ship by a tether. And we've had those for decades. If you remember, like the Titanic movie, that was an ROV that was exploring the Titanic with James Cameron. He's a huge person in like the super advanced stuff of this technology. So we all have those. It's just that technology for that's getting better and better. But that gets us to the thing that I think is really going to be changing the game, and that's we call them formally autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs. They're just underwater drones, just like the drones in the sky. But basically, imagine just a submersible or submarine that can go down there without humans and go and do things. And that's where things both get like really exciting if you're talking about ocean science. So imagine you just go across the ocean, or the thing that actually got my co-founders of my company excited originally. One of them's a big aviation buff, and that plane that went missing like what 10 years ago, MH317 or something, in the
Malaysian one. You're talking about the
Malaysian.
Malaysian one?
Yeah.
Oh,
The idea is like
yeah.
to try and find that you got to do one of those vessels with an ROV that's super expensive and you're just trawling. But what if you can put stuff down there that can just operate forever? So those autonomous vehicles, they allow you to have those type of access to do really cool things, but also potentially nefarious things if you want to try and cut a cable. Or if you want to do like a specialized, and this is like something that China and others have been looking at, some sort of deep sea mine that just hangs out down there and then attacks from below. And when we're looking in the US has been super successful militarily on the maritime environment for decades. A huge part of that is our submarine force, but the submarine force, it caps out. There's only so deep that it can go. And if you can go deeper than that, one, you can mess with all the infrastructure that's down there, but two, you can also attack the surface. So we know people are looking at underwater drones. We are too. No one's really operationalized them yet. We have them for science and some economic purposes. But imagine it's 2010. Like think it's 2010, and someone's like, "Hey, these drones, these aerial drones, are going to be a big deal." Like, do you scoff? That's where we are right now. Imagine we're going to be in 10 or 15 years with all this technology developing further. All of a sudden, we now have 60% of the surface of the world on the seabed open to us for things. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and you had said before, I thought it was, it's kind of funny. I've watched a few, I think Jill Heinerth and some of them have some really good videos on just how we've actually explored more of space than we have of our own oceans. It's kind of crazy how little is explored of our oceans. And kind of, it's actually, you're making me think. I actually wasn't really thinking about this at first because I've talked to people. So again, I don't know if, I think maybe it was confirmed, but Nord Stream, I think for most people, I think we know that it at least wasn't Russia who blew up their own pipeline. We can pick maybe your country, Ukraine or US or some, Great Britain, but somebody sophisticated, with a very good sophistication went down and blew up that pipeline. And now originally I was thinking about it in the sense of like us as divers. I think it's, up by up in the Baltic area, North Sea, and I want to say it's maybe around 300 feet, 270 or something like that feet down to where the cable would be. And I know we had, some of us had talked about, I mean, that's not your recreational dive. You're going to have some really technical divers. And then one to do that in the dead of night, to do that and be able to actually find exactly where you wanted to maybe have to place a limpet mine. Yeah, that was gonna be a really sophisticated operation. And I never really thought about it, but now I guess is for do you think there was a chance that maybe it was one of these deep sea drones and not necessarily a human that could have done that?
That's a good question. My bet would be just because of how fast this technology is going. If it was a robot, it was probably one of those remote operated vehicles with a tether. Like that's something that you could probably done somewhat covertly at night. The autonomous vehicles, they're just getting to the point where they actually have like clear military utility. And I'll actually point, if particularly if it was one of the countries, say, involved in the Russia-Ukraine war that wasn't Russia, um, Ukraine's been using a ton of maritime drones. That's actually been a huge part of what's happened in the Black Sea. That's been a big game-changing development. Is with aerial and maritime drones, they've effectively countered the much larger Russian Black Sea fleet and actually like destroyed a lot of vessels and put them all up in port. But at least as far as is publicly known, and this is going again to that open source intelligence thing I was talking about earlier, it's not clear they've used any underwater drones yet. And
Oh,
that's
okay. I was gonna say, I was like, I think you might be actually saying something I don't think anybody's ever mentioned out there is that potentially that there's actually a war of drones going on under the Black Sea. That would be quite
yeah, we haven't seen that yet, and I think in part that's just a matter of time. But that's actually kind of goes to like the key enabling technology here. It's AI, machine learning, the ability to have computers make decisions autonomously, process their own camera feeds. That's what's really most enabling for these autonomous undersea vehicles in a way that is not for aerial drones. Like aerial drones, you're still either with fiber optics or radio, you're talking with them. But now, if we actually have the drones able to do their own things underwater, because it's really hard to communicate underwater, that's where you now have this really different capability. So, yeah, Nord Stream, depending on who it was either really advanced, like, and you and I know, like super advanced divers, or it was an ROV. But those are really, I think, kind of the two main options.
yeah, no, it's just kind of cool. I actually never really thought of it as an ROV. I just, thought like, oh man, this must be some of the best divers, and so that's kind of an interesting one. You
So
opened my mind to
I
that.
was figuring this might be a good moment to bring up the story about how you and I met, also involving dark depths.
Yeah, so I guess do you want to tell it? um, yeah, I'll let you go on that one.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, okay. So yeah, this
I'll
might
let
be
you
a good
talk
segue into
you
some
talk.
diving. But I was it was COVID. I was getting back into diving, and I went and got my. I wanted to go diving in New Jersey. Had read like all the books about Chatterton and all the Jersey divers. And as you and I could probably talk about for days, like definitely an avid wreck diver, and like I just knew that, but I needed to go out there and actually do it properly. And I'd never done a deep wreck dive, and so I went to Dutch Springs the day before to get my deep water certification, and like went down to like 88 foot, like freezing cold down there, to make sure I could get my cert before I went onto the Jersey boat. Went onto the Jersey boat and then met you all. Actually did the first dive by myself down to like 102 feet, like really capped out, like it just hung out by the rope at the top of the vessel. Just like, okay, got to do this iteratively. And then the next dive I got with you all. And how would you describe what happened next, Andrew?
Yeah, so one of the things is obviously when you dive in Dutch Springs, it is very cold, but visibility is usually pretty decent. So I would say, and from a deep perspective, it's deep for most recreational people. Most go only go into maybe 60 feet, but for New Jersey, New York diving, it's actually pretty shallow. And so, so once we went out, so you did your dive and you got a little bit deeper. So you went down to 100, and the visibility that day was absolutely terrible. I'm pretty sure I remember having to like really struggle to almost even read um my computer on my hand. So or on my wrist or whatever. So we went down and we were on the Coney Island, which you go down, and we got down and the bottom is around 125 feet. And thought I had done it before. I'd done it with Andy Ball, and we were, I thought going from the bridge down to the deck. And like I said, Viz could almost barely see your hand. And I accidentally took us off the right side of it. And so I was like, oh, all right, we'll follow, the deck down. And I also kind of failed to miss that my compass had gone haywire with all of the iron in the wreck. So my compass was reading all jacked up. And so here I am thinking, oh, okay, we're gonna head on, we're gonna head south, and I'll just follow that, and we'll follow the decked out, and then we'll follow it back north, and it'll be easy. And ended up over in the sand. So we ended up a little off the end of the wreck, and I think we gave it a good 5 minutes or so of trying to find the wreck. Could not find it at all. And so Alex got to get his first fun experience in doing a free ascent from 100, and I think it was around 122 feet or something.
Yeah.
And when you've got no visibility and you're having to go up. Now, one of the things for people, I'm not sure, if they're not in the tech world, is as you start to go up, one of the things that happens is, like hot air rises, the air in your BC will start to expand. And as that starts to go up, if you don't let air out of your jacket, you will start shooting to the surface like a rocket. And from down at 120 plus feet, luckily we were not down there that long, but you could very easily get bent from down there. And so, one of the things I, was able to do is I took out dive sausage and took my reg out, put some air in it, and me, you, and Kyle all kind of hung together. And we kind of, by letting that go up to the surface, it gave us a reference point, which was huge, because if you were having to go up in complete blackness, it would be very difficult to make sure that you went up slowly so that you didn't shoot to the surface like a balloon. And so we were able to put up the dive sausage, and we were able to slowly make our descent up, and while I reeled in the dive sausage. And yeah, so we were able to make a calm, nice, relaxed, and safe make it to the surface. But I don't think that's what you were hoping to get into when you met us for the first time and you were on your second Jersey dive. So
Yeah,
you,
I mean, this is one where maybe naivety is beneficial, because I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, we're at a Jersey dive and we're doing a free ascent. This is totally normal. As opposed to we get out of the water and they're like, this guy's going to want to run away from us and never see us again. I'm like, hey, when are we diving again?
yeah, I was so shocked. I definitely hands down was like, yeah, he's gonna say, it was nice meeting you and goodbye. So, but yeah, the fact that you, and then since then we've gone down to North Carolina and done almost every wreck down there, and you're a pretty stellar wreck diver now. So, yeah, it's and I mean, I was we're talking about this a little bit with Kyle, but I mean, I don't we just did it in the last podcast, but most people don't have an appreciation for Jersey diving. I mean, everything is really cold, really dark, really deep, and it's very easy to go into deco if you're not paying attention, and it's, very easy for people to get narked and stuff like that. So it's one of those things where when things can start to compound if you're not really paying attention, and especially considering we go inside the wrecks as well, which a lot of people also dive them and don't go in. But if you do, you really have to pay attention that things can compound. But yeah, that was definitely a fun experience. But I'm glad you didn't run away, and you you actually, I mean, and you got to see it was once after that, and most things are going to be easy now.
Yep. And that was a good way to do my second dive below 100 feet.
Yeah. So all right, so cool. That was a good one. And then so So that's really kind of covering the deep sea. And, I mean, there's some spots that go down. People don't realize also, like, the Mariana Trench is deeper than even Everest. Well, if you're flipping Everest upside down, right? So Everest around 28, 29,000 feet, and Mariana Trench is over 36,000. So the ocean is just, it's incredible how deep it is. And it's pretty nuts that, but all those drones are going to make it huge on how, one, like you said, from a military perspective, and then two, from being able to lay cables and internet and just all sorts of different innovations. So it's making a huge impact down in the deep ocean. And then you want to go into space?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do want to go into space, but I can also talk about space.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. So again, this is another one that it's a fastly growing and changing industry. SpaceX and Elon Musk were definitely a catalyst, and they're by far the most publicly known one. But there's a bunch of other catalysts, and there's also things that got set up to make them successful. But essentially, we're kind of heading into this new space age where space always used to be really just governments, primarily defense, and then kind of science and NASA periodically and on the side, and for like really cool missions. But because of the success of renewable, reusable launch vehicles, so Falcon 9 initially, but increasingly other types of vehicles being developed, potentially Starship, potentially Blue Origin's New Glenn, potentially Rocket Lab and some of the efforts they're doing. It's now going to be much easier for commercial companies to get into space. And so what we've seen is an explosion in satellites. We call them mega constellations. So SpaceX and Starlink is the first one. I think I've lost track a long time ago, but it's probably 7,000 satellites now. You'll provide global internet. The companies, their valuation keeps rising like crazy. There's a bunch of other competitors that also want to do this, want to do that specifically. But because it is becoming so much cheaper, there's a lot of other commercial interests emerging. And the big one, especially when we're looking at our nuclear batteries, Earth orbit, there might be some specialized stuff like DoD and stuff, but really the big one is the moon. We're going back to the moon. It's not just to like visit, it is a strategic competition and race with China because of lunar resources. In the last 15 years, we've discovered that the moon has, relatively speaking, a lot of water and also a lot of other things too. But water is the big one because water is hydrogen and oxygen. You split that, you got elemental oxygen, hydrogen, you can combine it potentially with carbon. You can use all of that to make rocket fuel in space. And in space, we call it delta V, the amount of energy it takes to move, is the most limiting factor by far. That's why spacecraft used to need to be light. That's why it used to be that it was really hard for us to go to Jupiter or Saturn or Mars for all these science missions, because it costs you tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram just to get to Earth orbit, and maybe hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars per kilogram to get to deep space. And it was never economic to go to the surface of the moon. And even right now, we still assume that the first wave of commercial companies is $1 million per kilogram to land on the surface. But we can hopefully get that down by an order of magnitude. And if we get down 2 orders of magnitude, it means a kilogram to the surface of the moon is cheaper than it used to be to put a kilogram into Earth orbit. And if we can do refueling based on the moon, then all of a sudden the entire architecture and ecosystem of space allows us to do a whole bunch more cool things. It allows us to do more things in Earth orbit, but it also potentially opens up Mars. It potentially allows us to start doing all sorts of other really crazy things. Space solar power. We build massive solar stations in space. We can do helium-3 mining on the moon to power fusion reactors on Earth. So it sounds really futuristic, but we've now had 4 American-funded commercial companies try and land on the moon. One of them failed, 2 tipped over, 1 succeeded. That's actually a really good rate for any space missions, but especially going commercial. And so now what we're trying to do is standardize all of that. But that gets to, why do we need nuclear batteries on the moon? It's because all of those landers, when they land on the moon, they die when it becomes nighttime. There's no atmosphere on the moon, meaning that there's no heat retention. And the moon, like, just think, you can look out and probably see the moon tonight or whenever you're watching this. The moon takes a whole month to go through its day. And so it's a 14 Earth day long night on the moon. Spacecraft can't survive that. They freeze. Everything breaks. Those batteries, they drain and they die. And so if we put one of our soda cans onto this $100 million lander that's otherwise going to last for like a week, it can last for 5 years. And that's how we get to sustained presence on the moon. And it opens up for all of this cool mining stuff, all this exploration stuff, all this science stuff that not just the US wants to do. And this is where things are really different. Dozens of countries around the world want to get in on this. They want to be moon countries now. And that's something that like 10 years ago, you would have seemed crazy to say that.
Yeah, I think the one thing, I mean, it's just like you said, whether it's the sea or that, it's crazy. I mean, opening up all these other different areas that we can utilize to benefit us. And I mean, I think the mining thing I've been hearing about, but I guess the question I would ask is this. So, okay, you can get up there. Oh, you can start to maybe mine it. One, like you said, uh, but they're not super really strong batteries. So would they potentially run out quick if you're trying to do more industrial size mining or, substantial enough that would be meaningful for us? And then also, what's the reality on bringing that back? I mean, this seems to be the one big thing is reentry into the our atmosphere is one massive heat, but then two, just I mean, how do you get meaningful size back? You know what I mean? I could see bringing back a tiny little bit of something, but to bring back enough that's substantial and meaningful, is that's a reality?
Yeah, so that's a good set of questions. So first, like when we're talking about radioisotope systems, nuclear batteries, it's not the only power source you're looking at. It's a specialized power source that allows you to survive through the lunar night, potentially operate if you add some power generation to it. And it's not for like big manufacturing, like bulldozers and all the other things you're going to need. It is for nodes. It's for infrastructure nodes. Because right now, if one of these landers it goes to the moon, it needs to have all of its communication, all of its positioning, navigation. One of the reasons the landers are failing is they don't know where they are because they don't have GPS. So we need to essentially set up a whole network of nodes across the moon, in addition to having all the individual infrastructure to survive. But that's where we get to very large scale solar, and then everything just hibernates overnight. Or most likely, and this is also like where a lot of my academic work focuses, reactors on the moon, nuclear reactors and space reactors. And that's where we can actually potentially use all of the policy and the technical learnings from doing nuclear batteries to scale up in complexity. And that's when we essentially have as much power as we need. But yeah, so the other question, like that is the question right now. It's a chicken and egg question is there a market for space resources if you don't have the market? And can you even invest in the first place to make it cost competitive if you don't have that demand? And I think that the consensus right now, probably in the community, there's debate on if it will ever make sense to return physical materials to Earth. Maybe helium-3, because it is super valuable for fusion. It might be one of the most valuable things per kilogram in the world. Fusion and actually increasingly quantum computing. It needs helium-3 for their temperature environments. There's sub-zero temperatures. And so that's super valuable. There's several companies right now that are looking at mining the moon in the next 3 or 4 years to provide helium-3. They have contracts with the government. So like there's actual contracts here. So that's crazy. Platinum group metals from asteroids. There's asteroids that have very high concentrations of platinum, but those are the only ones that will return. Most of what we're looking at for space mining is mining for purposes of benefiting the space economy, but that doesn't mean it's not going to benefit Earth. Think about AI. Again, this is one like I don't particularly think that it's viable, but AI right now is constrained by energy and data centers. What if you just put a data center on the moon and transmit the data back? The data is actually pretty easy to transmit back. The moon actually might be a really good place for one of these data centers. You go find one of these super cold craters, and you provide the power to produce things and like actually run the computation. That could be a really good spot for a data center. I personally, there's a lot of reasons that doesn't work, but there's a whole bunch of information related things we can do in space, space science that we can do. But I think, and this is where a lot of people are starting to look, space solar power is the killer next concept. And this is where you put big solar stations around Earth and you collect power in space and you beam it back to Earth using microwaves or potentially lasers. And that allows you to have 24/7 solar power. help contribute to the global energy production. But all of those solar power stations, it's potentially a lot more mass effective to build them with space resources. So you put a big mine on the moon to build power stations in space, and what you're returning to Earth is just power waves.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. That makes the only thing that makes me think of is I read up a bit on, for instance, I think they at one point tried to actually put solar panels in the Sahara, and they were trying to ship the energy over to Western Europe, and the issue was clearly not getting the energy. The issue was the distribution, and I guess that's the thing is I guess it seems like that would be applicable. But, like, for instance, like you were saying with transmitting the radio waves back, wouldn't there be a latency? Wouldn't there be a delay having to travel, was it 200 something thousand miles? Or, you know, now you have to start getting into sending stuff somehow through the speed of light and other ways that would, um I guess those are just some other hurdles. So I guess it does seem like the most logical for now would be using the moon as a launching pad and a resource thing for doing other terrestrial things, whether going to Mars and other stuff. That seems the most applicable for now until maybe we bridge some of these other technology gaps, right?
Yeah, so I think if you're kind of looking at it right now, if you can't tell, I'm kind of an optimist, and I always go for the cool, exciting commercial application. Uh,
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
but I think the two probably most likely near term applications for space mining, other than helium-3, which I think is its own unique questionable market. One is refueling all these mega constellations that are launching. Because right now the satellites are lasting for like 4 or 5 years, and then they're just re-entering the atmosphere. And eventually, like I can tell you, I've already talked to some scientists. There are issues with dumping tons and tons of heavy metals into the upper atmosphere. Like it causes issues, and so you're gonna have some environmental blowback on that. But also, it's wasteful. It's inefficient. If you can start refueling those satellites, because right now we just don't assume we can refuel them. If it becomes cheaper to refuel them, then all of a sudden the value of that network becomes a lot larger. And increasingly, you could see over the next 30 or 40 years, most of the internet might go away from submarine cables. It might go into space. So like that's a clear market. But the other one, which I think is probably the most likely one, and the one that is I think significantly changing right now, is defense applications. And this is one where, again, the general public does not appreciate. The US has been the global hegemon for 30, 40 years because we dominate space, because we are the leading space power, and because we've been able to use our space reconnaissance satellites and our telecommunication satellites so that we know basically everything that's happening everywhere, and that we're able to make sure that our forces are aware of threats when they're coming and can respond in a way that's faster than anyone else. And also using GPS, we have smart munitions that can target things anywhere. So space is like a keystone in our military and how we run things.
Yeah.
China
And then,
knows that.
yeah. And then they mix that together with like the Five Eyes program and all that stuff, right? So now you've also got that with your allies across the globe.
I mean, look at what happened to Ukraine. Like Ukraine, one, very much we were giving them intelligence for sure, but two, they then were using Starlink to like at one point they put them on drones and were using them to fly drones until SpaceX pushed up back on that. But like the reason that Ukraine had internet at the beginning of the war was because of Starlink. And so there's a whole bunch of those type of things that like because we have space and because it's a U.S. asset providing that, it allows us to support our entire ally suite, but also because again we're not one of these super nationalistic crazy countries. We also can support civil society. We can support people that like want to just like use these technologies to understand, are they cutting down my rainforest? Are they doing XYZ bad things? And so it's a huge part of our soft power. GPS is another really good example. Everyone in the world uses GPS, and you use GPS in ways that like you don't think about or you don't understand. And it's not just about like navigating on the road. It's all sorts of things for precision location. But this is where like we get to the thing that's I think changing, and again where the U.S. might end up wanting to have space resources, is China knows this, and they've been developing strategies to be able to offset our advantages in space. They're developing their own capabilities to do all these things in space, but they're most worryingly, developing weapons to shoot down our satellites, both from the ground to send missiles up and shoot them down, but also in space assets that will be on other satellites that will track us and shoot us down in space. And so that gets to where really the development of the Space Force, which yes, it is actually kind of a joke. It's funny, but the Space Force is fundamentally about changing how we do defense in space. And one of the key parts of that is we spend sometimes even with cheaper launch costs, 500 or $1 billion on one of these really fancy, exquisite satellites to make sure that we can track missiles or we can protect our forces on the ground, but that can be knocked out by a pretty cheap Chinese interceptor now. And we also just use those once and we don't refuel them. They can't maneuver. They will always be in a known predictable orbit, which makes it super easy to plan. And so if you can start refueling all of those military satellites, if you give them mobility, then that completely changes how you do things in space. And this is where I think things are changing even faster now with the Trump administration. Golden Dome is potentially the most disruptive geopolitical development in 30 or 40 years because it's a strategic defense initiative, Star Wars from Reagan, part two, but we have the technology this time, it's potentially economic this time, and it's not even, I think, fundamentally about nuclear weapons anymore. It's about defeating ballistic missiles, and it's about protecting space assets. It's about U.S. having space primacy. And if we have space primacy, we can stop China from doing anything bad. It's going to be really difficult for them to invade Taiwan if we can defeat their satellite forces.
Yeah, okay, so that's actually something really interesting to note because at least for me, when I originally thought about Space Force and all that, and when I thought about the Golden Dome, I kind of figured it was almost in the sense more of just a ballistics protection thing, kind of like Israel uses it. Um, just like, okay, if Russia or somebody's shooting an ICBM over at us, we just shoot it out of, the sky. But that's kind of cool that you pointed out, and I didn't realize was that one of the big things is that it's potentially basically like going to be a missile system for shooting down stuff in space. And we're really kind of seeing it. I mean, we're watching. I mean, I don't think anybody thought. I mean, we obviously had Reapers and stuff like that. Bunch of years back. I mean, the CIA has been working on for a long time, but I mean, really seeing it in war applications, you didn't see it like crazy, and now all of a sudden there's like swarms of them. So we're really kind of watching how the future of warfare. I think the U.S. is actually kind of getting stuck in this like they're really trying to transition because for a long time, I mean, people were building tanks and building this, and I mean, kind of the old school way. And now we're seeing that like kinetic warfare is going to be like a swarm of drones. It's going to be deep sea submarines. It's going to be shooting, like you said, satellites up in space. Like a lot of it might not even occur really, right? Or maybe cyber, but it's not going to necessarily be the old school way that we view. Um, you know, I guess Russia and Ukraine might be one of the last, so to speak, just like old school land wars.
And but even now, I mean, that war is turned into primarily a drone war. I think like something like 85 or 90% of the Russian casualties now are caused by drones.
Yeah, it's
It's
definitely true.
it's like to the point like if it continues on 5 years, it could just be a front line that's completely robots.
Yeah, actually, I saw one of those things today. I think I saw somebody posted a thing with like the actual robots, and um, actually, I think what they were pointing out was that it was actually for going to like Mars or going to the moon. Was that one of the things is humans obviously can't survive out. There's no oxygen, but the robots can, and so um, that's one thing for people to maybe to think about. Is I know a lot of people were very fearful of it here, and obviously there could be negative applications here on Earth. But if we end up using these up in space or something like that, um, that could be a positive application for some of these robot drone people things. So
I'm still hoping that we can get robots in the house to at least do my laundry and fold it and other things like that. It could happen sooner than people think.
that is true. I mean, we always have that. What's that thing that vacuums your house and just keeps bumping into the wall over and over again?
The
But it'd be
Roomba,
nice to have.
yeah.
Yeah, the Roomba. Yeah, but it would definitely be nice to have one that does the dishes. I don't really like doing that, or at least puts it in the dishwasher for me. um, But all right, so then that's cool. I mean, and one of the things actually I was telling you, hopefully I'm going to have him on. He's a little shyer, but one of my family friends, he actually works on building satellites, and he was actually telling me, and I don't know, you might know more about Elon's ones because Starlink, from my understanding, are more low orbiting ones, um, and they're particularly more in remote areas. And I mean, I've used them when I was out in the Philippines and Indonesia and some other remote areas, but which it's become amazing. It's absolutely like game changing in that regard. But he was also telling me that, for instance, the larger satellites, what usually determines their life expectancy is the amount of fuel they have. And then the other thing he was telling me is that um, once they've kind of hit their end, they actually push them out into farther space. And so that was something. So I guess maybe the low orbiting ones are kind of coming back in, but I think the bigger ones they just push them out um, for now. But who knows? I mean, that all that stuff may end up becoming debris or an issue too in the field, that with them crashing into other satellites and stuff. So
Well, so have you heard about space debris, Andrew?
I mean, not much, but I mean, I just a little bit. I mean, I've just heard that people saying that some of this stuff could end up breaking the satellites because was it China or somebody either blew one up or something broke or whatever. And so, yeah, you want to tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so this is the number one environmental and safety issue in space right now is space debris. It's not radiation or it's not like asteroids or anything like that. It is we put up a lot of junk there over the last 60 to 70 years and we weren't thoughtful about a lot of it. And now stuff just collides with each other and it fragments. And so there's been weapons tests, which have, especially by China, have not been done responsibly, and they shoot debris everywhere. Like imagine like a shotgun, except the like all the shot just keeps orbiting indefinitely at tens of kilometers per second in some cases. But then the big thing that I think really opened up eyes, and this is again before all these new mega constellations, in 2009 there was an old Soviet satellite that got hit by an active satellite and it produced like 2,000 pieces of trackable space debris. Um, and that like overnight increased the space debris population 20%. And so there's this long-standing concern, which there's debate about whether it's true or not, but it's called a thing called Kessler syndrome, where essentially we might have debris that hits other debris that hits other debris, and it creates a cascade that makes all of Earth orbit unusable. And in fact, the not great Sandra Bullock movie Gravity um, is loosely based on that concept. A lot of scientific issues with that movie, but this is something that it's actually a huge part of the big constellations now. Is that we actually have rules to reorbit them or to deorbit them and burn them up in the atmosphere so they don't create future space debris. Or the ones that are really far out, we push them up so that they don't create space debris. But if we have, right now we have 10,000 satellites, there's projections that in a decade or two we could have 100,000 or 200,000. It's a completely different environment. It's super hard to model. And so this is where questions about refueling, about moving things a lot more, about having a lot more capability to just be active in that domain, that could be game changing. Or we just create a bunch of debris and then hit all of our space stations and lose space.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered, I guess, my question by burning it because that was the first thing I was thinking. I was like, man, now you have all these debris all over the place. Like, how are you gonna get rid of all that? It's like picking up, shattered glass on your floor, and good luck having fun picking that up, right? If that's all floating around in the air, I mean, that just seems like really hard. So I guess you're saying burning it up and whatnot would be one, I guess, way to do it. Yeah, so I guess that's I mean, and man, having that many satellites up there, I mean, they're gonna have to make sure they don't all bump into each other and hit each other. I mean, these are a couple $100 million a piece. Um, yeah, that's gonna be pretty interesting.
Yeah. So it's a fun time for the industry for sure.
And we were saying, so the predominant fuel sources they're using on current satellites right now is what, hydrazine and what, ion propulsion like xenon and stuff? Are those the two
Yeah. So
common they're fueled with?
yeah. So most of almost all the satellites they use solar for power for like electricity. But then usually they'll have some level of propellant. Usually get up there, they use like hydrazine. Increasingly, what we're seeing is electric propulsion or ion engines. Most satellites don't have that right now. And so most of the time, your fuel budget when you send it up there is actually just for station keeping. It's just to kind of stay in the same area. You don't really do a lot of big fancy maneuvers, at least right now. And so that's one of the things that is being looked at is how do we do a lot more maneuverability? And we do actually do it pretty frequently for deep space missions. So the first electric engines were actually for NASA applications. There's actually a really cool mission that's a good example that went to Ceres and Vesta, the two big asteroids, and was able to go up to like both of them and like do multiple ones. It's just ion engines. They are very low thrust, but very high delta V. So you can get very far. It just takes a long time. But actually, that goes to another one of the things that I've been looking at, which is obviously nuclear propulsion. So if you scale an electric engine way up, you can put a reactor on board. Now you got a ton of power, much more than you can produce with an equivalent mass of solar. That is potentially something that could be like a nuclear tug to go back and forth between the moon and Earth cost effectively, or to go to Mars in a pretty fast manner. And the other one's actually a full on nuclear rocket where you take a nuclear reactor and you actually just flow coolant through it, usually hydrogen, and you just shoot it out the back. And that's very high thrust, decent delta V. Both of these are better than chemical engines if we can develop them. But
But that's going to be
huh?
that's going to be radioactive, though, right? I mean,
Yes.
if you're doing that, that's. I mean, you have all of that going out the back. I mean, that would just be. It would be like having a Nagasaki or a Hiroshima. Like you couldn't be anywhere near that thing for.
So these would only be for use in space.
Gotcha.
But that's actually one of the huge issues is we can't test it on Earth because the output, as you said, is radioactive. And so if we were to do it, we need to test it in space. And DARPA actually just had a big program of NASA to try and do exactly that. That failed because they just couldn't get through their design gates. As a huge, like very DARPA, like kind of changed the ball game kind of stuff. But it's a huge issue, a huge challenge. So there's actually in Space Nuclear World like two camps. There's like the very Marshall Space Center focused camp, which wants nuclear rockets, very Werner von Braun kind of approach. And then there's less organized but nuclear electric propulsion, which I usually find myself in the camp in because it's hard enough to do a space reactor. If you do a space reactor, you put an electric engine on it. There's a couple other subsystems, but like that base technology is a lot more innovative as opposed to like foundational breakthrough with a nuclear rocket. But either way, like if you want to go to Mars, you need one of these. And here's like the fun thing, and this is like gets into what my dissertation's focused on. I'm focusing on nuclear safety with astronauts. If you get on a nuclear rocket to go to Mars, you'll have less radiation exposure than a chemical rocket because you get there so much faster that you get less space radiation. So even though you're right next to a nuclear reactor, the shielding cuts down on it enough that there's benefits of getting to Mars faster because otherwise it's such a long trip to get to Mars.
Gotcha. Yeah, and one of the things I mean, when at first when you think about it initially, you think about the nuclear radiation, and you think, man, you can never go near this place for how what 10,000 years or something like that. But obviously, we see with Nagasaki and Fukushima that I'm sorry, not Fukushima, Nagasaki and Hiroshima that so what is it like? There actually is a dissipation where the actual radiation levels, I think, from what they've at least tested, right, are not enough to like be super medically an issue after how long?
Yeah, so this goes again, think about like what we were talking about earlier with that spectrum of isotopes that you have when you're doing a fission reaction. A nuclear weapon is a pulse, and so it's just boom once. And so there is some stuff that gets produced, but a lot of it decays away pretty quickly. And so there's a difference between radioactive material and radiation. And so radioactivity, like a fission reaction or radioactive decay, produces radiation, but once the main source material is done or whatever radioactive material gets dispersed with a weapon, you lose a lot of that. But that's very different than a fission reactor where you're just running that thing for a very long amount of time. Your inventory of all those other things is a lot higher. And so you have to wait longer for you to reduce that amount of activity.
So how long do you think? So what? So if let's just say you ran a nuclear rocket, how big of an area would it be an issue that you could not be near, and for how long?
Yeah, so that's where I'm trying to figure out right now. So you essentially are going to have this reactor, and the rocket, because you're only running it for like 40 minutes or an hour for your burn on the way there, is not going to have as probably as much inventory, but it's going to be a very large reactor because you need a lot of heat to do that. Versus an electric propulsion system, that's going to be a much smaller reactor, but you run it for a longer period of time. And so your relative inventories of radioactive materials might be pretty different. And you also have one that the electric propulsion will have a radiation field and an active fission reaction all the way around it. But essentially, if you're like looking in space, you're going to have what we call a shadow shield. You're going to have a shield right next to the reactor that produces a shielded area where your people are and where all of your equipment is so they don't get dosed. But everything outside of that is going to have a pretty high dose, especially while the reactor's on. Once you're at the end of life of that reactor, we don't currently have practices for what you do to dispose of it. Back in the Cold War, we did have reactors, primarily the Soviet Union, that we used in low Earth orbit. They just left it up there. Those are space junk, space debris issues like we were talking about earlier. If we're going to Mars, especially nowadays, we need to have a responsible place to store that for really centuries, most likely. It's probably going to have to be some sort of orbit somewhere. And you're going to have probably, honestly, like several kilometers in space around it that's going to be like a no-go zone that you wouldn't be approaching. But yeah, these are all things that like we don't really have rules right now for how this works. We don't really have good standards. We're just trying to figure out some of the basic policy or other considerations. And actually, here's a fun one. People in my work hate me for this all the time. Mark Watney from The Martian.
Yeah.
So this is actually how we often tell people like what nuclear batteries are. He remember that the plutonium radioisotope system he dug up. He dug up that gold plated thing. So that was a plutonium system that he used for heat to survive. Yeah, so that's like what radioisotopes are. You're able to have heat on Mars. But I went ahead and I did a calculation, just messing around, and you actually got a substantial amount of dose from that.
Yeah.
Because he was like,
he was warm.
Yeah, it was warm, and it was like 2 feet behind him for like 2 months. So like, yeah, you're gonna get some dose from that. And the plutonium systems, like, they definitely have less dose than other types of isotopes. You can shield most of it, but he did get dose from it. But here's the thing that like I didn't realize till I was running this analysis. My estimate, there's a difference between the book and the movie. In the book, he got 8 what we call REM. Your annual limit is 5 REM as a radiation worker. Most people don't get more than 1. So like imagine 8 years as a radiation worker, what most likely is really your limit. That's how much he got in the book. In the movie, because he was not smart and he had it right behind him, he got 40 REM.
Damn. Okay.
That's a lot. That's like 2/3 of a NASA astronaut lifetime limit. So again, those are like, whoa. But then here's what I didn't realize until I was doing this analysis. Do you remember when he does the when he's trying to get back to the ship at the end and he does like that Iron Man maneuver? Yeah. So that ship has a nuclear electric reactor on it that has been running for like 4 years at that point, and he's outside the shadow shield, which means that he got a lot of dose on that.
He's, I mean, it's a movie, but otherwise he's getting completely toasted.
Yes.
There's not a chance in hell, but that's why
Yeah,
they get the Hollywood, right?
and this goes to like where, look, we can figure out ways around it, and it's not like a game changer, a game like Ender. But if we really do want to go to deep space, we got to figure out radiation, and we got to figure out radiation biology and how to do treatments for it. Because like we can mitigate a lot of dose, but we are going to get radiation to a substantial degree. Cancer treatments and what's happening now in the medical sector is super promising. There's also a lot of other things that we can actually do. Maybe do genetic testing of people to figure out who's more vulnerable to radiation versus not. But like those are one of the big things. Like if we're heading towards being a spacefaring civilization, we need to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear definitely, I mean, that seems like something we definitely do have to solve because, I mean, you see this with the nuclear subs and you see it with all this other stuff that it just, I mean, there's nothing else that we have that runs for 30, 40 years. Like, I mean, it just opens up it's a super game changer in that regard. Yeah, and it's just tough. It's like, it's the most beneficial, but it's also some of the most in small assets, but it's dangerous. It's definitely something you gotta which you kind of had touched on is part of a big thing that you guys have to is the packaging. The packaging is so important to make sure that there isn't any exposure to that nuclear material, that radioactive material. So, um, so
Well,
what do you?
the way that I
Oh,
like
right.
to put it, which I think helps with people, because like all these nuclear, especially like I call them nuclear bros, or like nuclear is safe. Like, let me like put a reactor in your house or whatever. I'm like, maybe not. It's a hazardous technology that we make safe through smart engineering, through a dedicated professional base, like a dedicated industry, and through effective regulations. And like you can have dumb regulations, you can have potentially like not a very effective industry, but like that's how we do this. And we do all sorts of crazy hazardous activities. Airlines, the fact that flying a commercial airplane and like going to like on a vacation is one of the safest things you can do. It's safer than driving to the airport. Like that's how we turn hazardous into safe with all of these dedicated technical and human systems. And so that's like one of my big things not being a safety professional is like we can do this. We just need to be smart about it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've kind of always felt that, like, with regards to the whole energy thing, I've always felt we should use every asset we can at our fingertips. Um, I mean, we do this a lot with the yachts that we sail and stuff like that, where you kind of, everybody jumps and pounces on one form of energy versus the other. I've really kind of always seen it as um, they all have their purposes, they all have their areas where they shine, so to speak, and they can all add to a whole system. So, I mean, you could potentially have it where you're pulling from nuclear, you're pulling from solar, you're pulling from, nat gas and all that stuff. And then, we're sending LNG. And I mean, when you put it all together in the pie, it really makes, yeah, I just think that, I mean, and that's what drives everything forward. If you have cheap energy, I mean, that's what drives all of our stuff. So, yeah, I think that's definitely, I mean, it's definitely an important thing, and I'm glad to see that it's coming back. And as you said, the I think like most things, if you really take it seriously, and you actually don't cut corners and you realize that it's important, we can make most things safe and efficient. And it's nice to see that the technology and the innovation is actually making it um, able to do it safe, but also to do it more cost effective. Because I think some of the other aspects was when stuff went wrong, their easy, quick solution was, oh, we'll just make reinforced concrete like 20 feet thick. You know what I mean? And it really, along with the regulation, kind of added on to the costs, and it also made it very cost prohibitive. But the fact that that's kind of they're innovating and stuff like that, and the batteries are getting, even smaller, and we're using different stuff, and you're using different things that are safer. It's definitely going to be an exciting thing, and it's really cool that it's being used in all those other different applications, and so, yeah, be exciting stuff, so,
I like to
um,
say the future is now, but like actually, it's happening.
it it really is, and I mean, and a lot of people, and just to add a positive on it is like, you watch the regular media and, it's hard to not feel like everything is doom and gloom, but then, when you really get to look at some of this stuff and you see that, you really see where the potential is. And when you actually look at the positive applications, um, there's a lot of things that can really make our lives um, more efficient, better, and potentially could be deflationary and bringing down costs and stuff from an energy perspective and whatnot. So, um, yeah, I mean, I can't steal Mr. Patrick Bet David's line of the future looks bright, but it definitely, I think there's a lot to be excited about. So, but yeah, so I really wanted to thank you for coming on. And I really think that your background and your experience and everything like that, I mean, I hope and think that this was a ton of information and some really good stuff for people who are interested in where nuclear is going and where the battery space is and whatnot. And so yeah, so I just wanted to really thank you, and hopefully, yeah, maybe we'll do another one in the near future. So
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and excited to see the podcast moving forward. I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting conversations. I'm definitely looking forward to checking out Kyle's.
yeah, no, definitely. Kyle's one was really good. For anybody who, if you haven't seen that, it's all about Nazi U-boats at the Jersey Shore, and so that's a really cool one. And we have some couple guys coming up. One guy's a spine and orthopedic surgeon, a couple commercial airline pilots, and some mountaineers and stuff like that. So we'll hopefully have a nice, diverse group and touch on stuff. So, but thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. And yeah, we'll chat soon.
Cheers.